everyone to tonight's annual Maggid Shiur. First, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Tessler, and I am the new chairwoman of the Women's Beit Midrash of Efrat and Gush Etzion, as well as a teacher there. And we are super grateful to our generous donors for making tonight possible. The Donchik family, in memory of Sidney Donchik, Yeshayahu ben Yoel Vilea, and Menzel Genauer, Menachem Menzel ben Moshe Yehuda Halevi Esther, as well as Rabbi and Mrs. Michael and Chai Schmidman, in honor of the students and teachers at the Women's Beit Midrash. After Divrei Bracha by our founding Beit Midrash, Rabbanit Batya Hefter, we will hear from Rabbi Mishael Tzion, who is the director of the Mendel Program for Leadership in Jewish Culture and the educator on everything Pesach, Haggadah, Seder related. You've probably heard his name before because he is the author of the well-known Haggadah, A Night to Remember, the Haggadah of Contemporary Voices, which he co-authored with his father, and is personally one of my favorite family Haggadot. Then we will hear a Hebrew lecture given by Rabbanit Chamutal Shoval, who is the new Rosh Beit Midrash of the Women's Beit Midrash, and I will introduce her before she speaks. I will now turn over the mic to Batya for her always inspiring words of bracha. Thank you, Batya.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. It is such an honor. Truly, it's an honor to see at least all the names on the screen. I'd love to see you in person. And it's an honor. I'm really honored to have you as the head of our, as the head of our Beit Midrash, and as the head of the board, and as an educator on the board, and together with Chamutal, our Rosh Beit Midrash. It's really a blessing that the Beit Midrash, which we nurtured for a generation, will continue to flourish. Midor Lador, very appropriate for the Maggid. I want to ask a really very simple question. And that is the fact, I want to ask the very simple question is the fact that we were slaves in Mitzrayim is really foundational to our identity. What do we need to remember? Why do we have to zachartem to look at it? Atem yadatem et nefesh hager ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim ve'ahavtem ve'ahavta lo kemocha ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. This notion about what is the most important thing that we need to learn from the Pesach narrative, and particularly the notion that we need to remember that we were once gerim. I think these few psukim already indicate the answer, but I want to stress it because sometimes I think while we are now the majority and we're firmly placed, we sometimes forget. Ve'ahavtem et hager, love the stranger, because once you were strangers in a strange land. I think that the foundation of the Pesach story is sensitivity, empathy, compassion, and love. We're expected to love the ger because we were once strangers and we know what it's like to be oppressed, to be left out. I think compassion is supposed to be part of our DNA. So I'd like to, even the Seder, we open up the Seder, we're called Dichven. We invite everybody to come and take a seat at our table. So I think I want to say one more idea, and that is, who's the ger today? So you have the classic ger, you have the Sudanese, you have the B'nai Menashe who recently came. But in terms of our own homegrown women's Beit Midrash, the ger may simply be somebody that you don't know, in Ole and Ola, somebody who's not in your age group, somebody whose ideas you're not familiar with. So I would say that for a generation, Baruch Hashem, the Women's Beit Midrash, with a lot of wonderful people, we aim to be a place where everybody could feel at home. Tzabarim, Olim, people of different ages, people with different backgrounds. And it's my tefillah that the new and exceptional leadership, Sarah Tessler's head of the board, and Chamutal Shoval as Rosh Beit Midrash, will continue to lead our Beit Midrash with wisdom, sensitivity, and compassion, and so that the Beit Midrash will continue to be a place where everyone will have a place at the table. So it's nice to see that you're all here at this virtual table. And at this point, we'll pass over the baton to Rav Mishael Tzion, who surely knows how to get everybody engaged at the table with all kinds of different people. Ve'ahavtem et hager. thank you very much. And that's looking forward to have an exciting evening.
Thank you, Batya. Thank you, Sarah. And it's great to be here. Last year, we did a class. It was just the beginning of COVID in so many ways. And I think we did a class about how to think about COVID and Pesach in Hebrew. And this year, in a preparatory conversation with Sarah Jo, she mentioned, could you speak a bit about the American Jewish experience and the way in which thinking about the American Jewish experience helps us understand Pesach, and how thinking about Pesach and Leil HaSeder helps us understand the American Jewish experience. And I have to say that despite my nice American accent, I was born in Yerushalayim, probably like many of your children. Growing up in Batya, you can sometimes come out with more of an American accent than growing up in Queens. My father, Noam Tzion, who thanks to him, Mamash Zchut Avot, I fell into working on Pesach and have so much to say about it. V'zeh mitorato. But one of the things I sometimes realize is that to tell a story of an immigration, you need the second generation. The immigrants themselves often don't talk that much about the immigration. If you think about it, if you think about maybe your grandparents or great-grandparents, or think about yourselves like, Lama ze chashuv? Why do we have to talk about our story, our immigration? We chose to come here to Israel. We don't need to talk about America, right? Or our great-grandparents would say, we chose to come here to America or to Israel. We don't want to talk about Russia or Poland or North Africa. And it's often the second generation or the third generation that is super interested in trying to understand what was the story there? What are the parts in me growing up in Yerushalayim that owe to some other culture and to some other dimension? And so for the last few years, I've been thinking a lot about not only the Israeli Jewish story, to which I'm very committed, but also the American Jewish story, and what we as Israelis, and specifically Israelis who do not come from American families or from Anglo families, what do Israelis have to learn from the American Jewish story? But I'm used to teaching about the American Jewish experience to Israelis. I have to admit, I'm wondering what will happen now in the next 45 minutes as I try to share with you some thoughts about the American Jewish experience with people who are probably bigger experts than I am. So let's try and go out on this journey. What we're going to do is we're going to actually look at, this is Maggid Hagadol, we're going to look at two elements of the Pesach Seder. One is we're going to look at what is the big story of Pesach. What is the big story of the Seder? And we're going to try and tease out four different stories and see how those stories are told differently in Israel and in America. And second of all, we're going to use Arbat HaBanim to try and understand something about the generations of the American Jewish experience and of an American Jewish Hagadot. At the end of the day, through all this, I think you'll also be able to get some good tips and ideas for your own Seder. זה תמיד גם עובר לעשייתם. But before we start, I just want to ask you, first of all, if there's anyone here, if you have your camera off and you're in a situation where you can turn on your camera, it would help me as a teacher to see who I'm speaking to. And second of all, I want to ask you in the chat, if you could just write in the last two times when you know in your family that there was immigration, that there was moving from country to country. Thank you so much to those who just turned on their cameras. So you might say the year when someone in your family made Aliyah to Israel. And if you're from North America or from other countries, when was the previous immigration? And let's just get a sense of the different stories here in our own room. All right, so. So some of you wrote the Aliyah to Israel, and if you're able, also say there you go. We have some 1915 Poland to USA, 2005 USA to Israel. Right. In my own family, Jacob Schweid from 1884 made it from Germany and arrived in the Philadelphia harbor and took the train all the way to St. Paul, Minneapolis. but those different generations where we came, Egypt to France to Israel, in 1939, Russia to Israel, Hungary, USA, Switzerland, USA, Israel. So many different stories and different moments. At a very basic way, we often think about how Leila Seder is a night of Yetziat Me'avdut Lechilut, but it's also a night of immigrants telling stories to their children who are no longer immigrants. Ki Yishalcha bincha machar le'emor mazot assumes that our children, when your children will ask us one day, what is this about? That there's a story that the parents know that the children don't know. And that's the very basic element of the Seder itself. So thank you. As the answers keep on coming, let's get us started. Okay, I hope you can see me. So just to share, and as Sarah said briefly, I come from a family that loves the Passover Seder. My grandfather made Aliyah in 1947 and served in the Haganah. They didn't know what to do with an American rabbi soldier, so they told him to go guard Shai Agnon's house in Talpiot. And we have a Haggadah that my grandfather wrote together with Shai Agnon in 1948 for the soldiers of the Haganah. That they did a Leil Seder for them in 3 mishmarot because they had to keep guarding Talpiot along that time. We only found that Haggadah a few years ago, but maybe that explains why my father in 1997 created a Haggadah called The Different Night, based on what he had learned from his teacher, Rabbi David Hartman. And a few years later, he asked me to create a Haggadah, an Israeli Haggadah. And why? What's the difference between the Haggadot and something we might be able to speak to a bit later? And after that Haggadah came out, we also created another Haggadah, again in English, called The Night to Remember. And we'll talk a little bit about what these 3 Haggadot are about. But I wanted to start our session with this picture. Let me try and get myself out of the way. If we're thinking about the American Seder, and we're thinking about Seder as a night of immigration, the picture to start with is this picture. This is the first Haggadah printed in the United States. 1879, very early, if you remember your American Jewish history. 1880 is when the very big immigration to the Jewish immigration to the United States starts. 1882, Sufot Banegev, if there are people here who studied the Bagrut in history. 1882 is when Eastern European Jews start coming to America in millions, 2.5 million Jews from 1882 to 1924. And just to think about those numbers today is mind-boggling. A third of the Jewish people effectively get up, leave the Pale of Settlement, leave Eastern Europe, and move not to Israel, but to New York, to America. But before them were the German Jews. And the German Jews who came from 1840 to 1880, and before them, the Spanish Portuguese Jews, the Migroshe Sfarad, who made their way mostly to South America, and from there up to North America. But I'm not so much interested in the history, I'm interested in the moment when parents and children sit around a table. And here in 1879 in Chicago, the illustrator, who we don't know his name or his details, draws a family around the Passover Seder. And we're kind of left to figure out who's who. So take a look at this picture. Mia ben hachacham, mia ben harasha, miu atam, miu sheino yodea lishol. What do you make of these, of the images here? You can either open your microphones or answer in the chat. We're a small enough group that we can have a conversation.
Okay, I'll unmute myself just to say that the person sitting at the head of the table looks like he's dressed in very contemporary, modern, upper class clothing, smoking a pipe. He looks like he kind of made it. As opposed to the man to his right, which I looked at him, I thought, wow, he looks like the Rambam. Like he has this old world, European look to him. So it's fascinating to see those 2 men who don't look like they belong on the same table together.
Great. So then this is their picture for Arbat Abanim. So who's which Arbat Abanim, right?
Yeah. So I would guess the Rambam looking guy would be the Chacham, I think.
For the father.
Right. But it's interesting that he's not sitting at the head of the table. I don't know if that means anything or not. that it's really the Rasha who's kind of like commanding the space, right? He's in charge.
Smoking.
Yeah. but he has the position of kavod at the table.
Exactly. So I think you
He
put
has
Sarah.
money.
Yeah, he's wealthy.
You put your finger on exactly the tension in this picture, right? The picture has the parents, the father and the mother. It's nice to see the mother at the table, not always depicted. And to the right of the mother is a child wearing white, and to the left of the father is a child wearing black. But the child who's wearing black is the one who's at the head of the table. And notice his body language, right? He's leaning back in his chair. I can almost hear my grandmother scolding him, all the way to here. He's leaning back in his chair and he's raising his hand, right? Like, what's going on here? And from my understanding, this is definitely the Ben Arasha. And notice he's smoking. I'm not sure the smoking is a bad thing as much as it reflects his modernity. He's a modern gentleman. He's wearing modern American clothes. He's sitting there in his smoking jacket. And he's looking at his father and he's raising his hand. He's saying, Ma avodah azot lachem. And we can immediately assume that the Ben Rasha is indeed, according to this illustrator, he's the Rasha, he's the modern. And this picture is telling us, don't be modern, stay traditional. Be like the Ben Chacham, who's wearing the same traditional clothes as his father. We know this is a German Jewish family for two reasons. One is the father's head covering is kind of a traditional German Jewish head covering that a chazan would wear. If you're the chazan, you also have like a little ponpon on top, right? But if you're not, you wear this when you're doing services or prayers. And his son is wearing similar clothes, and they're both wearing kittles, right? The tradition of wearing a kittel on Leila Seder, the same as on Yom Kippur. We can see it right here. But the energy in the room doesn't belong to the Ben Chacham. The energy in the room belongs to the Ben Rasha, and he's the one sitting at the head of the table. And this presents a reality we know about immigrant families, which is the parents have a hard time acculturating to the new culture. And often it's one of the older children who speaks the language faster, who knows how to wear the clothes faster, who's making money faster, and who leads the family. Perhaps this Ben Rasha sitting at the head of the table immigrated to America a few years before his family and used his money and his savings to bring the rest of the family over. And what then happens is a kind of a hipuch, tafkidim, a reversal of roles, right? Where suddenly it's the son who is the breadwinner, who has. How do you do vehigadet lebincha in this kind of situation, in this kind of reverse reality, right? You can suddenly feel the tension in the room. And the tension is raised when you notice that the tam v'sheino yodea lish'ol are looking excitedly, not at their father, tell us the story, not at the chacham, you're the one we admire. They're both looking at the Rasha. And the parents have this kind of frozen look. The Ben Chacham is stuck in his book, and it seems that the illustrator is criticizing the traditional parents here, as opposed to what you'd expect from a Haggadah, right, or from a Bat Banim, really putting the traditional parents on the spot.
For helping out.
So I love starting with this picture because I think it represents all the tensions that happen, I think, in any immigrant family. Just this week, I was talking about Ethiopian families in Israel and how challenging it is to be a young boy and how challenging it is to be a father in an Ethiopian family, where usually your wife will be earning more than you, speak a better Hebrew than you, get along better than you. And samchut hahorit, the parental authority, kind of crumbles away. And we know that happened in many immigrant families as well. You might know stories like this yourselves in your own families, where there was maybe the grandfather who made a lot of money, who knew how to work and so on, and who paid to bring, he didn't make a lot of money, maybe he made enough money to bring the rest of his family and kind of became the new patriarch of the family. We're going to go back to Bat Banim, to the different pictures, but I just wanted to start with this as kind of an image in your mind. 1879, a moment before the huge immigration to America. This is already the American Jewish story. It's a story of a family sitting around the table where where challenges of tradition and modernity, of the energy in the room, of what does it mean to be moving forward. It's very challenging to do vehigadet lebincha in this kind of situation. And yet, if we zoom out for a second, I think that what Leila Seder is really all about has one very clear goal. And I repeat this whenever I teach about Leila Seder because I feel like it's often overlooked. The Haggadah itself tells us what the goal of a successful Seder is. We often think, I don't know about you, I'm concerned at the moment about our family Seder. What are we going to eat? How are the kids not going to fall apart in the middle? How are we going to get everyone to behave and not fight? What about the relative who isn't vaccinated? This is mostly what I'm concerned about at the moment for Leil Seder. But the truth is, what I should be thinking about is, how do I make sure that this Leil Seder achieves its goal? And the goal of Leil Seder is very clear. The goal of Leil Seder is that every person who leaves the Seder, and specifically the younger generation, feels that the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim is their story. Not just a story that they know happened in the past, not just a story that they know the details of, not just a story that they know that happened to their own family, but a story that they experienced beguf rishon, in the first person. And that's exactly what the Haggadah says. Be'ofen mefurash, although there's kind of some tikunei girsaot here for us if we know the text, right? B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. This quote that appears in the Haggadah, that appears in the Mishnah, I take this to mean this is what the goal of the Seder is all about. By the end of the Seder, I need to feel like this story happened to me in the first person. But how does that happen? How do we get that to happen? So when we created our Haggadah, we asked our illustrator, Mishael, to create a picture of a family that has the experience of B'chol dor v'dor. And so we ended up creating two families. One family coming out of Egypt, and one family, an Israeli family, on their way to Sinai for Passover. And here they meet on the border, on the Israeli-Egyptian border at Taba crossing, perhaps, right? And they're looking at each other and they realize they are the same family. Sure, one father has a beard and the other one has a ponytail, but Besach HaKol is the same family. And that's the understanding, I think, that the Haggadah wants us to understand and to create. And the Haggadah also has a very clear strategy for doing that. Its strategy is to make sure that we don't just tell a story, but that we create a full-bodied experience. And I think this element of the full-bodied experience is also always worth pointing out, right? If we want to understand the organizing element of all the different parts of the Haggadah Shel Pesach, and it's a very complicated and long text with all kinds of choreography and elements in it, is that all the different elements of the Seder are all inviting us to turn the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim into a full-bodied experience. We tell the story, we sing the story, we act the story, we hit the story, we drink the story, we eat the story, right? We wear the story. Everything we do, we're doing the stories in all kinds of ways. We turn the story into a game by stealing the afikoman. We turn the story into riddles by asking Manish Tanaim, Pesach Matzah Maro. We keep telling the story in so many different ways. We have a Beit Midrash about the story, that's Arami Oved Avi, right? Every different element of the story. And we feel like we ourselves are the ones leaving Egypt because we eat the very same menu that our ancestors ate. So we turn the story into a full-bodied experience. And that's how the story starts moving from generation to generation. But then you kind of have to ask, wait, what is the meaning of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim? And this is where it starts getting interesting, I think, and brings me to the next element of our session here today. I want to claim that you can read the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim as 4 different Jewish stories. That when we ask, what is the Jewish people about? You can actually tell 4 different stories. And in fact, I would suggest that if we examine the way American Jewry and Israeli Jewry, if we would poll Israeli Jews and American Jews and Jews the world over to ask, what is the Jewish story? We would hear different renditions of the following 4 stories. One is a story of family tradition and continuity. One is a story of always opening the door to the other. One is a story about taking care of the Jews, saving the Jewish people. And the 4th is about always walking to the promised land. Now, we're used to all these stories being mixed up into one, but we also know that different elements of the Jewish people take one story to the extreme. And I would also add that you can read the Kodesh Baruch Hu into every one of these 4 stories. You can read this as a religious story. And you can also read this as a story where the Kodesh Baruch Hu is not in the center. And we know that for today, for many Jews, they are connected strongly to the Jewish people, connected strongly to the Jewish story, not necessarily connected strongly to the Kodesh Baruch Hu. And even that gives pause. But I mean, while Pesach for me is an experience full of faith, I think the reason that Leil Seder is such a powerful experience with over 90% of Israeli Jews and over 80% of American Jews all celebrating Passover Seder is because the story works even without the Kodesh Baruch Hu. If you'll just let me, that little bit of a pikosut, which I think is actually about a belief in Klal Yisrael. But let's see these 4 stories in different ways. And I'm going to run through them a little bit quickly because I think you actually know these 4 stories. You know them very well. The first one is that the story that we tell on Leil HaSeder is a story of family, tradition, and continuity. That the most powerful element of Leil HaSeder is that I'm eating the exact same bread that my ancestors ate 3,000 years ago. And I'm telling the exact same story. And I'm passing that story to the next generation. And what I want them to do is to go out of the Seder and say, I'm going to have a Seder for my children and their children after that. To know that we are carrying a heritage. We are one of the only people in the world who are still eating the same bread, telling the same story. And the awareness of that is a very important element, right? If I have to choose one quote from the Haggadah, which says this more strongly than anything, it's Ha lachma anya diachlu avhatana be'ad Mitzrayim, right? Zeu lechem ha'oni, this is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in Egypt. I'm eating the same bread on the same night at the same time. And the power, the awareness that on Seder night, almost all of the Jewish people are eating the same menu, telling the same story, and that we've been doing this for so many centuries is one of the most powerful elements of the story. And maybe if you erase everything else, this is what you'll remember. And that the charge of Passover Seder then is to conserve, leshamer, to conserve the story, to pass it on to the next generation. Keep that in mind. I put a picture here of David Ben-Gurion from our Haggadah because as I said, you can read this as a faith story and you can read this as a secular story. For Ben-Gurion, it was a secular story, but that didn't prevent him from appearing before the Peel Committee in 1946 and telling them, here's why I'm going to convince you that we deserve Eretz Yisrael. And he tells them a story about what he calls the Jewish Mayflower, right? About how 300 years ago, a ship called the Mayflower set sail to the New World. And that this was a great event in the history of England. And yet, does any Englishman know at what time the ship set sail? Do the English know how many people embarked on this voyage? What quality of bread did they eat? And then Ben-Gurion says, yet more than 3,300 years ago, before the Mayflower set sail, the Jews left Egypt. And every Jew in the world, even in America or Soviet Russia, knows on exactly what date they left, right? Tezvav b'Nisan. Everyone knows what kind of bread they ate. Matzah. Even today, the Jews worldwide eat matzah on the 15th of Nisan. And they retell the story of the Exodus and all the troubles the Jews have endured since being exiled. I love this story also because it connects a kind of American element to the Israeli element and how there's a shared heritage there. But the way in which the Jews have conserved their story of immigration sort of shows us just how powerful that story is. But that isn't the only story we tell on Leil HaSeder. Because immediately after, as Batya said at the beginning of our session, immediately after we say this is the bread that our ancestors ate, we then say, Kol dichfin yeteh ve'echol, kol ditzrich yeteh ve'yifsach. And I think the second story we tell on Passover night, that the Jewish story is about always opening the door to the other. That the Jewish story is about remembering shegerim haynu be'eretz Mitzrayim, and therefore we have to do ve'ahavta et hager, 36 different mitzvot to make sure that are all connected to loving the ger, remembering that we were gerim, an ethical message of the Jewish people. And we practice that ethical message on Seder night. And it's about, we're okay, how can we help others now? And maybe in the 17th century, we weren't okay. Maybe in 1941, we weren't so okay. But in 2021, we're doing pretty okay. Whether we're in North America or in Israel, if you disagree with me, we can argue about that later. And since we're doing okay, we're able to sit around a table full of food tonight. It's our obligation to open the door. And I'll just say b'sogreim that I think that on this COVID year, we learned how much more important it is to always be aware how to open the door. And that even when we can't open the door because we're in bidud and you're in bidud and there's a seged and richuk chevrati and everything, social distancing, it's even more important that we open the door. The door might be metaphorical, it's all the more important to open it on Seder night. So a story of tradition and conservation, a story of taking care of the others. We're okay, now what can we do for others? And there's a third story. And the third story is B'chol dor vador kamim aleinu lechalotenu. And I brought again this illustration of Mishael Kishka from our Haggadah. We asked him to draw B'chol dor vador omdim aleinu lechalotenu. He said, that would be terribly distressing. But I'll think of a fun way to draw it. And so he tried to draw a collection of all the people in the Jewish who tried to persecute the Jewish people. And you have here the Nazis leading the charge, and Pharaoh in the back, and some crusaders, and Pope Urban, and Ferdinand and Isabella from the Spanish expulsion, and the Damascus blood libel, and Khmelnytsky. In the original illustration, he drew a kind of a typical secular Israeli looking at these guys and saying, "Ma atem rotzim mimeni?" What do you want from me? And at the end of the day in the Haggadah, we decided to actually take her out, because if this is the picture, then they're running after her. But if this is the picture, then they're running after us. And that small difference, I think, makes a big difference. But if the previous story was about taking care of the other, this story is about taking care of us, of having faith in the Kodesh Baruch Hu, who saves us, whose promise to Avraham, Havtacha Avraham omedet lanu, stands for us throughout the years. But it's a story about making sure that we have to stand by the Jewish people. And if you think about it again, there are many Jews for whom this is the most important Jewish story. Helping open the door to others, we can talk about that later. Let's first of all talk about how to take care of ourselves, how to make sure that we're safe, how to make sure that never again to us. So here's an element of the Pesach story that, again, some people, for them, this is the entire Jewish story. Which brings me to the fourth story, which I call Forward to the Promised Land. A basic element of the Passover Seder is that no matter where we are right now, teaches us Chassidut, right? Teaches the Kabbalah. Wherever we are, it's probably Mitzrayim. And wherever we're going, it's probably the Promised Land. And all we have to do is start fighting the dictators, fighting the power, fighting the pharaohs, internal and external, and bringing the world to a better place. And it's a never-ending journey. And we're always going to the Promised Land. And we want to go to the Jewish Promised Land, but maybe we want to go to the universal Promised Land. We want to bring our family to the Promised Land, but we don't want to go there alone. We want to bring as many people as we can. And this Jewish story, which I would call in some way the progressive Jewish story, right, is a Jewish story that also inspired Christians in the French Revolution, saying Pharaoh and King Louis XVI are the same person. We're going to fight them and bring the French people and indeed human civilization to a better place, right? Or the Puritans in America fighting against the King George, right? Or Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, fighting again the pharaohs of their time. So here's a story that is a very universal Jewish story, and it's always about moving forward. 4 Jewish stories that in each way, they kind of, everyone, you can tell a story of what Judaism is about as just this story. For some people, what's the Jewish story? Always opening the door to others. Or lagoim, making sure that we can help others. Remembering that we were gerim and making sure that any other ger today has to be taken care of. For other people, the Jewish story is about passing our story forward. My grandfather put on tefillin, and you will now put on tefillin. And that's really important to us. We're going to keep doing the pathways of our ancestors, because if we don't do it, who will do it? And a third story, it's about taking care of ourselves, right? As Golda Meir said once, I don't know if I believe in God, but I don't know if I believe in the God of Israel, but I believe in the people of Israel. And I'm making sure that I'm going to keep the people of Israel safe no matter what I do. And finally, a progressive story. It's about change. It's about moving forward. The past was dark, and we need to get to a better future. Part of what I love about these 4 stories is that they kind of contradict each other. Not exactly contradict each other as much as they create a machloket that I think is really healthy. One of the things I think we're seeing in the world today is that both in America and in Israel, we are being pulled between a progressive story, a liberal story, and a conservative story. A conservative story that says the world used to be simple. Everyone knew their place. Men were men, women were women. No one was trying to move between those 2 groups. My grandmother was a very good person. Don't tell me that she was racist, right? Everyone knew their place in the small world. It's kind of the Walt Disney image of, can we go back to small town America? And that conservative vision is very powerful in the world today. And alongside it is the liberal story that says we used to be racist, we used to be misogynist, we used to be narrow-minded, we used to be parochial. We're moving to a better place where everyone will be equal, we'll see everyone's rights, and it's going to continue more and more freedom for as many people. Behind us is only darkness, in front of us is the light. And I think what's so important on Leila Seder this year, this is my personal feeling, is that we tell both stories on Seder night. We tell a conservative story and we tell a liberal story. And they're not necessarily contradicting. They do create a very powerful machloket, but we're telling both of them. We're eating the same bread that our ancestors ate, and we're not going to stop eating it, even though it doesn't taste so good. We're going to keep eating that bread, right? And we're using that though also to move forward. And keeping both of those stories is very powerful. The same goes to the other two. I'm opening the door, but I'm also taking care of my family. And keeping that tension between the different stories, I think, is actually something that we can contribute to the world in this time of polarization and tension. Okay, so I'm just going to breathe for a second. If anyone wants to make a comment in the chat or open their microphone or say something, prove me totally wrong, tell me there's a fifth story, which I'm sure there is for the Seder, or anything else, and then we'll move on to Batya Banim.
Yeah, I'll say something. Before you mention that tension, I was actually thinking of another tension between 3 and 4. Because on the one hand, we have 3, which is our personal story. It's very particularistic, right? And then we have the universal one. And in today's climate of constantly being accused of cultural appropriation, we can kind of like, I was just thinking that like, we might even feel defensive about other movements, other liberation movements taking our story. Like, what do you mean? It's about us Jews. Why are you using it for all these other movements? But I don't think we feel that way. I think we're actually proud that our movement becomes a universal movement.
It's true. Although we do have some memories of some people taking our story and then claiming that they're the true Israel. We're a little nervous. You could call Christianity the first cultural appropriation, right? It's not the Bible. It's the Old Testament. So we have some scars from that. But I agree with you, Sarah, that we take great pride that this is a story that is used and reused in many ways. We're just careful that it's not used against us. Okay, and thank you, Stephen, for the comment about Cotton Mather, who indeed made the connection between themselves, the pilgrims like Moses and Mishael. And I think it was Ben Franklin who wanted the United States insignia to be not the eagle that we know today, but the seal of Moses crossing the Red Sea and fighting evil behind him. So there's a strong streak of that story behind us. Okay. We have about 10-15 more minutes, right? And which brings me to the second section that I wanted to talk to you about. We talked about 4 Jewish stories of Passover Seder. But the truth is that we know what happens when we as parents or grandparents try to tell our story to our children. If our mission on Passover night is to make sure that our grandchildren or children take our story and feel as if it's their own story, we know what happens when we tell stories to our children, right? About 50% of the time they'll say, lo manien, od pam hasipur hazeh. We've heard that story already. It's not relevant to my life. Every once in a while, we'll meet a child who will say, that's so interesting. Tell me more. What was the temperature that day, right? And they'll want to know all the details. And some children will just ask very basic questions, and you're not really sure, do they get it? Do they not get it? But they're super excited to hear the story. And some children, there's just no way to ever have those powerful conversations. How can I ever insert the stories when it just doesn't seem like we're able to have a dialogue? And I think the pashtut that Batya Banim, the midrash of Batya Banim that appears in our Haggadah, appears there exactly for that reason. Batya Banim are 4 responses when a parent tries to tell their story to children. And those 4 responses can be understood in all kinds of ways. But every generation and every time and place creates those different responses in different ways. So this is how Mishael Kishka, the illustrator of the Israeli Haggadah, drew the Batya Banim. Right? For him, the Chacham is sitting on a pile of books, but he doesn't actually need them because he has his laptop and he's eating his matzah. The Rashan, his rollerblades, is skating away from the story, holding a bagel. The Tam is eating his matzah, but he's happy to take whatever the mainstream culture will give him on TV. And the Sheino Daddy Shol is standing in front of choices and he doesn't know what to choose. But then we said, can you also draw Arbat Banot? And here he took a text from Rav Yitzchak Nissenboim, a famous drasha by Rav Yitzchak Nissenboim, one of the important Agudat Yisrael rabbis in Poland before World War II, who already then talked about how there aren't really Arbat Habanim, there are Arba Dorot. And this goes back to our picture from Chicago from 1879. All right. The first generation is the wise generation. They were traditional. They knew how to read the holy books. They were loyal to the story. The second generation is Ador Mardani, the revolting generation, who's not interested in the story. The third generation doesn't even know how to have the conversation. They're tam, they don't even understand what the inheritance that they received, that they are refusing to accept. They don't even know what it is. And he says it's the fourth generation, it's the Sheino Yodeh Lishol, who we might be able to have a conversation with. Michel Kishka is an Israeli-Belgian secular artist, and he didn't really like Rav Yitzchak Nissenboim's full reading of it, but he liked the idea of four generations, and he drew the four Israeli generations. Here's the Bobe, the grandmother, the Savta from Eastern Europe or from Rabat, reading her Tehillim with her head covered. Her daughter is a secular Israeli reading Amos Oz, smoking a cigarette, but she's still reading a novel. Her daughter is already reading just the newspaper, and it's her granddaughter that is sitting under the table, and she's reading Sir HaSirim, the most important Israeli book ever written, right? It's the potty training book by Ilona Frenkel, but it's also a pun on Shir HaShirim, which we also read on Passover night. So maybe that's why this child is reading Sir HaSirim. So in one picture, he was able to draw, I think, the four generations of a certain Israeli secular, today we would say very Ashkenazi picture of the way we can understand Israeli society as four generations. A few years later, we created a second Haggadah in English called A Night to Remember. And again, we asked him to draw an Arbat Habanim that wouldn't be so Israeli, but that would be more American. And this is what he created. I can move myself along the screen here. And when I show this picture like we did before, I ask people who are each one of the Arbat Habanim, and it's great to see the responses. This is a women's Beit Midrash. But for many people, they look at this picture and they'll say, Aresha'a ze im hakippah v'Talmud, barur, right? The wicked child is the one with the Talmud and the kippah. Other people will say, no, she's the Chachama. There's the one who's reading Kabbalah with Madonna and floating in the air. I think she's the Tamah for Kishka. And for him, the Bat Resha'a is not Resha'a at all. She's Maldanit. She's a political activist. She's into fighting for abortion rights and she's against animal tests. It's the Bella Abzug version of the Bat Resha'a, I think, for him. So those are Arbat Habanot, which again also tell a very specific moment in time, I think, in American Jewish history. And that brings me back to talking about Arbat Habanim and Arbat Habanot as moments in time in understanding the American Jewish experience. So I want to talk about 5 generations of American Haggadot and 5 generations of American Arbat Habanim. We'll go through them. We started already with Chicago, 1879. When remember that our Ben Arasha here is the one who's wearing modern clothes, and the Chacham is wearing the traditional clothes from Germany. Now go with me 40 years forward, and let's go to the Lower East Side in 1920. And look what happened. The Ben Chacham is the one who's wearing the modern clothes. Because a suit doesn't mean you're not traditional. Le'efech, a suit means you're serious. You're a rabbi. But we still remember that 40 years before that, wearing a suit on Passover night meant that you were, right, that you were a Ben Arasha. But here you can be the Ben Chacham in the same, look, he looks exactly like the Ben Chacham from the previous picture, stuck in his book, but he's wearing a suit and a hat. The Ben Arasha here is the boxer. And Jewish boxers and Jewish strongmen were a thing in the 1920s and 30s. Max Nordau's Yahadut HaShririm, Muskul Judaism. There's a famous synagogue in Brooklyn, Temple Beth Elohim. Sorry?
He wanted it. He said that Jews have to get out of their femininity and start using muscles.
Exactly. Max Nordau wanted Jews to become muscular Jews, but for this illustrator, that's a Ben Arasha, right? I was saying there's a famous temple, a Reform synagogue in Park Slope, Brooklyn. The bottom floor is the beautiful sanctuary, and the top floor was built as a boxing ring because they knew that's what would bring the young Jews into synagogue, into the temple. Today, that's mamash passt nicht, right? That would not fly by. But in 1920s, that was a big deal. By the 1950s, something else is going on in America. And this is the America that my father grew up in, that maybe some of you grew up in as well. Everyone is wearing modern clothes. The question isn't modernity or not modernity. There's a bigger enemy out there, and that enemy is communism. And here, the Ben Chacham is still reading his book. He has his prayer shawl, but he's also like a relic from the old world. But look at the Ben Rasha, holding an axe, held at the 10 Commandments, and about to break them in two. This isn't Moshe Rabbeinu at Chet HaEgel, right? This is Trotsky. The Jewish communists are the Ben Rasha. This is printed 2 years after Ethel Rosenberg, right? And the Rosenberg couple. We have to be careful, right? The most dangerous Jews are the communist Jews. 10 years later with McCarthy, things will change a little bit. And 30 years later, things will change even more. But there was a moment in American Judaism where to be a socialist or to be a communist was a very dangerous thing to do, at least in the 50s and 60s in the suburbs. No, look at the Ben Atam wearing a flannel shirt, nothing more American than that. And he's reading the comics and the race scene, but there's nothing bad about that. Here he's smoking. This could have been the Ben Rasha from 2 pictures ago, but now he's the Tam. This is just your normal Yid. He probably belongs to a modern Orthodox or a conservative temple, and that's just fine. And we can't talk about American Jewry and Passover without talking about the Manischewitz Haggadah. And one thing I want to say about the Manischewitz Haggadah, the Maxwell House Haggadah. There's also the Manischewitz Haggadah, but the Maxwell House Haggadah is one of the clearest signs of American Jews becoming deeply American and being at home in America. And this moment where the tension is no longer between immigrants, right, that speak the language and don't speak the language. We all speak English, and we're going to read the Haggadah to a large extent in English, but also we're traditional. We're not playing with the text. The text is the traditional text. And we're going to read it, and when we buy our coffee, we'll buy our Haggadah in the Goyish supermarket. And there's that, I think it kind of represents the depth in which American Jews were able to feel at home in America. There's a lot more to say about the Maxwell House Haggadah. I think the most important thing for me is that the cover changes, the text doesn't change. And here are 2 examples of when the text starts to change. In 1969, Arthur Waskow, a year after he was supposed to celebrate Passover Seder with Martin Luther King, he decides that, and Martin Luther King was assassinated 2 days before Passover. He creates a Passover Seder where Jews and African Americans have Seder together. And he writes a Haggadah called the Freedom Seder. And he rewrites the Haggadah in what we might today call a kind of Jewish renewal, rewrites the Haggadah, not in the way that the conservative or reform movements rewrote their prayer books, but in a radically different way to retell a totally American story. If I go back to the 4 stories we told before, here the story very clearly is about moving to the Promised Land and who we're moving to the Promised Land with, right? Jews for Urban Justice is about opening the door to the others. Why don't Jews need urban justice? Because they already moved out to the suburbs and sold their homes to African Americans who came from the South. But now they're coming back from the suburbs to take care of urban justice. And by the 1980s, Jews feel so much at home that they can take famous Jewish comic characters and make a joke on them as the Arbat Abanim. So here are Groucho, Harpo, Zeppo, I'm missing one. Chico, right? As the 4 sons. It's so obvious. Once you see this, you can never understand the Arbat Abanim differently. By the 1990s and the 2000s, something else happens. And I think my father's Haggadah is part of this move. I have to say, this is in the book that I wrote, that A Different Night sold over 250,000 copies in the United States. And that means that a huge percentage of American Jews are sitting around the table with that Haggadah. And I think what was part of what was unique about this Haggadah is that it kept the traditional text on one hand, and alongside it added different stories without playing with the traditional text. And that mahalach, which in some ways is kind of a modern Orthodox mahalach, but deeply modern and deeply Orthodox at the same time. We keep the traditional text and we add to it in so many ways. The next generation after that is no longer a book at all. It's a website, hagadot.com, which you can go online and create your own Haggadah in whatever way you want. So those are 5 generations of Passover Haggadot in different ways. I'll say just in parentheses that there are also 5 generations of Israeli Haggadot, which we don't have time to go into, but the same trends you can see in Israel as well, just on a different timeline. The Haggadot of the immigrants, like Haggadot in Arabic and Hebrew, Yiddish and Hebrew, Russian and Hebrew. The Haggadot of the Kibbutzim, which tried to rewrite the Haggadah, similarly like the Freedom Seder in many ways. The Haggadot that retell the story in a new way, like a feminist Haggadah, Vigadet Alebitcha, our Israeli Haggadah, and also like the Maxwell House Haggadah, the consumerist Haggadah that you'll get with Makor Rishon or Yediot Achronot or Ala Mishmar, full of advertisements, and it's part of the consumerist culture that we live in. But I want to end by just going back to the 4 Jewish stories. In many ways, you could look at the different generations of American Jews and of Jews in the 20th century as each one holding on to a different story. We saw in the Chicago Haggadah a story where Passover night is all about children hearing the story from their parents and continuing the same story. And we saw Arbat Abanim also as those who are, where the Ben Chacham is the one whose job it is to open the door to the others, to make sure that other people have space. We saw an element where it's about saving the Jews, where the Jewish story at the end of the day is, and we have to fight that. And finally, that the Jewish story is about always walking to the promised land, not just us, but everyone, as much as possible, to the promised land that will always be ahead of us. But no matter what Jewish story we're telling, the Haggadah urges us to make sure that it's a compelling story, that it's a story that our children and the participants at our Seder and we ourselves say at the end of the night, this is my story. I feel it in the first person. So I hope for you, whatever Jewish story you're telling, or whatever combination of those 4 stories you're telling, that you're going to tell it in a meaningful way and share that story on to the next generation. Chag Sameach, Toda Rabah.
Amazing, thank you.
Look at the very early immigrants Haggadah, whether they're in Israel or in Israel, but they didn't have his grandparents. I remember Yudit Spiro telling me, she's there, about their wedding when her husband had 4 grandparents, right? And that was very unique in Cleveland because nobody had so many generations. People who immigrated just immigrated. I read this year a book by Rivka Gover about her perspective of Klitat Aliyah and the great immigration just after the Hakamat Medina. And the theme is they have generations. They've got their grandparents with them because the Olim Mizrach, they came fully, like a full generation. They had grandparents, whereas the Ashkenazis did not, or many of them did not. So when you look at when Mishael Kishka draws 4 generations of Jewish people, that's today. For many of us,
they didn't have the 4.
Not many of people my generation maybe, but people who are slightly older and definitely in the 50s, having older people having a full set was very, very odd.
Yofi, thank you very much, everyone.
So thank you, Rachel. That was fantastic. I have
Thank you, Mishael.
lots of notes that I took that I plan to bring up at my Seder with my kids. I think the Arba Minim is just so fascinating, and kids connect to it, and the imagery. I love the art. Fantastic. I plan on going back to your Haggadah and Xeroxing some of those pages to give out to the kids around the Seder so they could really connect to it.
Thank you.
Okay, so